I'm Greg Wheatley, and my guest today is Dr. Susan Greener. Dr. Greener is Associate Professor of Intercultural Studies at Wheaton College. She has done a number of things before coming to Wheaton College, among those having served as a programming leader with organizations like Mission of Mercy and Compassion International, serving children and doing ministry and work in something like 30 nations around the world. So one of the things we'll certainly want to talk about is her involvement in global ministry. Susan, it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
And nice to make your acquaintance. We were getting to know each other and finding out we're kind of in the same stage of life with grandchildren and grown children and
exactly.
that time of life. So how long have you been at Wheaton?
This is just the completion of my third year. I was an undergraduate here many moons ago, and it does feel unusual to be back on campus and be a professor. There's a little bit of that idea of being an imposter. Like,
yes. Yeah.
Am I really smart enough to be here?
And you also begin to realize what you put your teachers through, right?
Exactly.
And you're a little repentant for that, I'm sure. And interestingly, you're a pastor's wife.
I am.
Yeah.
My husband is an Anglican church pastor in Highland Park, which is north suburban Chicago. And he's also a canon in the Shira Diocese of Rwanda. So we have connections globally there as well. And he's a third culture kid.
Yeah.
So the global piece is just kind of part and parcel of everyday life.
And you've got a huge commute to work.
I do. Audiobooks.
Audiobooks, there you go. Or Inside Wheaton podcasts. Yeah.
I have to admit, I only listen to fiction when I'm driving.
That's probably not a bad idea. Kind of keeps your blood pressure down.
Exactly.
Yeah. One of your passions, Susan, anybody that reads about you or reads your bio and so forth will learn quickly that you love to minister to children at risk. Talk about what that sort of moniker, what that means when we say children at risk.
I think the temptation is to move fairly quickly to labels: street child, trafficked child, child soldier. But really, all humans have risk and resilience factors in their lives. And they are all created in the image of God and given dignity in that way. I think the church historically has ministered to children, especially children at risk, but not as full participants perhaps in the church or in God's mission. Mm-hmm. So what we've been working toward maybe over the last 25 years is a right and proper attitude toward the child as a full human, complex member of God's family. And what does that mean in terms of including them, protecting them, and allowing them to develop into what God has created them to be. Removing barriers, but also building their capacity to cope with what life throws their way.
Something you said a moment ago interests me, and I want to maybe dig into that a little bit. This idea of viewing children as total participants. It's easy to sort of, they are children, and they need our nurture, and they're not full-grown adults, and yet it's easy for us, I think you're saying, to kind of relegate them to a secondary status.
Yeah, I think that's true. And scripturally, it's not a very accurate view of how God used them in the covenant story. If you think about players in that story, many of them were children when they were used, whether it was Samuel or Joseph or David or Moses' sister rescuing him from the side of the river.
Right.
They were not just bit players, but they had an important part to play in the covenant story. And then, of course, Jesus came as a child in the usual way. Mm-hmm. So redeeming all of that developmental time. So do we really look at them biblically and theologically from a perspective that looks at all of Scripture? Or is it something that, as you said, they're kind of put to the side, relegated to something cute or sentimental? And I think, unfortunately, in the church, one of the most segregating hours is Sunday morning. You go to your class and you're separate. You're separate from the body. Mm-hmm. And that's one example of marginalization in a way.
Some churches have started looking at that and sort of intentionally trying to have family worship rather than Sunday school and segregation and teenagers go here and 7-year-olds go here. Are you a proponent of that? Is that what you're getting at?
It's one of the things that I think needs to be addressed. When a church becomes too crowded, one of the first solutions is often, we'll remove the kids. And that is saying something about how you value them and their contribution to the church body. What does it mean to be the family of God? A family of God without kids present is saying something that probably we don't theologically endorse, but it's a temptation nonetheless because it's efficient.
Yeah,
and it's easier.
Practical in some ways. One of the things that when we talk about your interest and your passion for helping children at risk is that you think many of them are there, and it's obvious, I suppose, because of extreme poverty. So poverty is a real factor in children at risk. That's
probably the primary factor. If you are extremely poor, you're likely to have other risk factors that are a part of your life. There's more abuse. There's less health care. There's less access to education. There's more likelihood of domestic violence and just all kinds of things happening because those families are under great stress. And when you're under great stress, you don't parent as well as you could. And addressing that is really a big part of what God has called us to do in terms of witness and holistic ministry. And children are more likely to be negatively impacted.
And that applies, I'm assuming, whether it's a country somewhere the other side of the globe or right here in the United States.
Exactly. Right? I mean, poverty is a contextualized definition. It's, are you able really to be a part of the community in which you live? Or do you lack the resources to really be a part of life, of daily life in your community? And that's going to look different in different places.
Yeah. Talk about, as I said in our introduction, you've been at work in 30 or more countries, and so you've seen a wide gamut of all of these issues. Talk about some of the most interesting things and maybe the most severe things you've seen as you've been around the world.
Some of the more difficult circumstances, Calcutta would be one example. Mission of Mercy has a lot of work in that area, and it's a difficult city. It is about the size of Colorado Springs, but has 15 million people crammed into that geographical setting. And just the press of humanity, the color, the smell, the sensory overload of growing up in a place like that, where every square inch seems to have a person on it, living, working, doing something. The same with the slums around Nairobi. Both of those places struck me more in the way, though, yes, this is a hard place to be, but you know what? I think that I'm a pretty smart and capable person, and I wouldn't last a day here. And then you have to really admire the skills, the resilience, the giftedness, and the tenacity of the people who call that their home. And I think that's always the tension that I feel in those situations is what can we learn from the people who are really struggling for day-to-day existence. And I'm afraid most of the time the church, academia, the West is preoccupied with problems that are problems of luxury. And being reminded to return to where survival is of the utmost importance, I think, is a good check on what we're called biblically to do.
We even know that. We've made a joke out of that lately, right? We say that's a first world problem. When I say, do I have to go 2 miles to the store? We've sort of... The challenge, it seems to me, and one of the things I think you're alluding to here, Susan, is, say, to go to a Calcutta, view it from Western eyes, and have compassion for them without being patronizing. Because we also are very good at sort of saying, here, let me help you, give you a handout. How do you do that? How do you navigate that tension?
My field is really human development and family studies. And it is residing in a school of thought, human and community development. So you look at psychology, sociology, anthropology, how those intersect with one another. So it's basically the person in the context of their family and their community and culture. There's some universals that we hold to in terms of all people are born, they live, they eat, they marry in some sort of fashion.
These are
They have
things we all
children.
share.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's research that we have on many of those transitions or stages of life, often done in the West, but not always. We can talk about those general principles and ideas, but the local practitioner, the local person is the expert. All I can offer is, this is what we know. Now, how does it look here? And the persons who are part of that church body or that local ministry or that family have to be able to take that and contextualize and question. And that's where it works. It's the bridge between worlds. So that's kind of how I see my calling, is bridging academia and the practice, but feeling like the church is the place where transformation actually takes place. So how can you empower God's people to do his work without damaging his children?
Yeah. Are you finding that students here, undergraduate students, are eager to do that? That they're passionate about learning how to reach out and do that kind of work?
I think there's always a desire, an emotional response, if you will, to a suffering child. And that's why you hear often, I mean, I wish I had a nickel for every person who said, I want to work in an orphanage, but an orphanage isn't really the best thing for kids. So what you take is that passion and that desire and say, okay, how can we do this well? And I think a Wheaton student does desire that. They have the passion, they want the tools, and they want to do it in partnership with, not for, or in a patronizing way, as you suggested, work alongside for the betterment of children. And that's where it gets exciting, is when you can help empower them and give them the knowledge and the tools and experiences that they need to learn what that might look like. And the opportunities to fail, because that's part of this process too, that just because you're smart and you went to Wheaton doesn't mean you've got it all figured out. Yeah.
You just burst a lot of people's bubbles.
You are going to fail.
Let me bring us, Susan, to another part of your life, and I know another passion area, which is working with families and with marriages. Christian parenting, if we had, you said you wanted a nickel for every time somebody had, I wish I had a nickel for every book that was written on Christian parenting. What does it mean to really be a Christian parent? I mean, when you get beyond the rules, and the 10 do's and don'ts, what's the idea of a Christian home and a Christian parent?
Well, there's some ideas that I have that are kind of percolating, so I'll offer some thoughts, and it'd be interesting to even hear you push back on that. One thing is having a proper attitude toward the child, not as a possession, not as a person who is here to affirm my value as a parent, but as a human being on loan from God as a gift. And a parent as steward is a very different picture than what we typically see, even in parenting books. I think there's often lip service given to the gift of the child, but it's almost like my performance as a parent is the important thing.
Right.
And that's where my value comes from, and how successful is my child. In some cultures, it might be how much money does my child earn, or how powerful do they become. For the Christian home, it might be how spiritual are they, or do they ever fall away from the Lord. But again, that person's not really taken as a gift that is God's creation, but more my input.
A lot of our self-esteem rides on how that child turns out, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think in the church often we judge other parents not fully understanding perhaps some of the struggles that they might have. And
one writer, you're reminding me a little bit of this, talks about not necessarily trying to raise a good little boy or girl, but from a spiritual standpoint, to raise a child that understands God and His grace. There's a little difference there, too, isn't there? Because sometimes Christian parenting seems to want to protect a child from everything that might be wrong, sort of insulate them, and just so they can grow up to be a good little boy. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I think that desire to build a hedge around your family I think also prevents us from being salt and light. And that's one of the things that relates actually back to children at risk. Whose children am I responsible for? Am I only responsible for my biological children? And if you think about New Testament relationship, ethnicity and biological family are broken down. And Jesus is calling us and saying it's the family of God that is important. And if that's the case, then I am responsible maternally for all the children in my church, not just my own kids, not just my own grandkids. Yes, I will likely spend more time with them, but to say I'm absolved of responsibility and I can create my own little world that protects them in a bubble is, I think, shirking my duty.
How does the church begin to get at that? Because that, I hear you describe that, and I agree with that. That's a big turn, though, from where we've been. I mean, to begin to understand that we have responsibility beyond our nuclear family is maybe a little bit radical.
It could be. And then teaching in intercultural studies, when you're looking around the world, how can we learn from the diversity of cultures and how they have approached family? And one of the things you can learn is that on rankings of individualism, the United States is at the very top, the most extreme. What does that mean for our culture, and how do we critique that? If we care mostly about the individual, that is something that we have to guard against. We have to be willing to say, okay, there might be good things about that, but there can also be negative things. And I think one of them happens to be in this area, that I look out for me and mine, and that's where my responsibility stops. I was just hearing the other day about some research on common good, and that argument fails on all sides of the political conversation, for example, to persuade Americans to engage in anything in terms of a positive response. And so I understand it is something that would be seen as radical, but looking at Scripture, what am I called to do? And Jesus really did say that it's not Jew nor Greek, male nor female. We can go on. We could add the age piece to
Adult
that too.
Child,
exactly.
Yeah.
That it's also here is my brother. Here's your mother. That this biological relationship is not the primary one.
You're talking about Jesus' whole new kingdom ethic, really, aren't you?
Exactly.
That it doesn't do away with families, but it supersedes, in a sense, the family unit, doesn't it?
Well, I would say it breaks down who's your in-group. And that really goes back to even the parable of the Good Samaritan. Who is my neighbor? Well, Jesus not only said that our neighbor was more than those who are like us, but love your enemies. So he made it kind of hard.
Yeah, pretty radical, isn't it?
It is pretty radical.
Susan, it's great to have you here. Thank you. Thank you so much for being a part of Inside Wheaton.
You're welcome.
Dr. Susan Greener is Associate Professor of Intercultural Studies at Wheaton College, and would also like to mention that she will be serving as Program Chair for the Lausanne Consultation on Children at Risk, which is set to take place this fall, November of 2014. By the way, if you'd like to find out more about intercultural studies or about Wheaton College in general, please do visit wheaton.edu. For Inside Wheaton, I'm Greg Wheatley.